Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. In the book of Daniel, it was the writing that appeared on the wall of King Belshazzar's palace, written by the unattached fingers of a human hand. Daniel is brought in to translate these mysterious words. The days of your reign are numbered. You have been weighed and measured and ultimately found wanting, and your kingdom will be torn asunder. With President Biden 1 year on the American throne, many are asking if the writing for his presidency is already on the White House walls. Just 1 year ago, Joe Biden became the 46th president of the United States of America. What should be an anniversary party feels more like a commemoration to better days gone by. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we'll be weighing and measuring the Biden administration's performance after 12 months in office with a number of special guests, all experts in their fields. Now, I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners on KSRM in Kenai, Alaska on 920 AM and 92.5 FM. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. Inflation at a 40-year high. Gas prices hitting the poorest the hardest. Energy on the verge of becoming a scarce commodity. And we're just 1 year into Bidenomics. Can it get any worse? And are there any remedies to make it any better? We're joined by economist and author Andrew Moran to figure out the economic cost of 12 months under Joe Biden. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, it's scorecard time. What rating do you give Joe Biden on the economy?
Well, I guess if it's out of a 10, probably a 3. And if it's a letter rating, perhaps a D or a D minus. You know, it's hard to find any redeeming qualities or achievements under Bidenomics. Everything has been a disaster. Usually when you have presidents, you can say, okay, well, this was a good thing and that's a good thing. So perhaps the only positive outcome I can see all this is that at least the budget deficit was lower. But that's not really due to President Biden or his policies. That's only due because last year this time, you know, not the whole country was open up yet. Many places are still closed. So the deficit went down. I guess that's only a positive thing. But I'm sure next year, though, it's going to be up from this year.
Well, it's a situation back to normal, of course. Now, what are some of the main economic challenges that Americans have faced this last year?
Well, I think the main thing, of course, is the hot buzzword that's been dominating business, like the business media, is that it's inflation. If you look at the CPI data, the latest one, the December Bureau of Labor Statistics report, everything was up across the board. Food was up, energy, electricity, apparel, used cars, medical services, everything was up. I think the only things that were down were girls' apparel and blinds. That was it. Everything else
that's you and I sorted for the weekend, Andrew, certainly.
You know, at any time that the public has gotten ahead, Bidenomics just reared its ugly head and erased those gains. So, you know, in this economy, it's really benefited the workers. The problem is that real wage growth is actually contracted. It's down. Last number I saw was, I think, 2.8%. So any wage gains that they've enjoyed over the last year has been completely gone. Interest rates, they're still at 0.
Let me just jump in on that, Andrew, for a second. So this is something we actually hear an enormous amount in let's call it the legacy media or the very pro-Biden media, as they say, wages have gone up. People are doing better than ever before, and we hear that. But when it comes to actual real wages, when you take into account the cost of rising goods, the inflation, they're actually doing worse off despite that number on their paycheck being larger than it was before. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. The last number I saw was also from the December jobs report, and it was that wage growth was up over year 4.8% or 4.5%, and the average hourly earnings are about $31, a little more than $31. Wages have gone up considerably over the last year because companies are so desperate to hire workers or retain their current crop of employees. Problem is CPI, PPI, the PCE price index, they've all skyrocketed over last year at a four-decade high. So all these gains they're evaporated, they're gone. And then if you take into account interest rates, the real interest rate, it's negative. So if you're saving money, if you're somehow saving money in this economy, you're putting into the bank, you're losing it because of all that price inflation that's going on. This is a terrible time. It's funny. This is the best of times and the worst of times. It's the best of times for workers, but it's the worst of times for the poor and middle class. Whether it's scarcity, shortages, inflation, it's a terrible trifecta, or it's a perfect storm for bad news.
Well, speaking of this perfect storm, Andrew, it does seem to me that each problem almost rolls into another, and that compounds the main issues. So is there any way for President Biden in his second year to reverse this, well, let's call it what it is, a perilous course for the American economy?
Yeah, I've suspected for a long time that the administration would launch a fourth stimulus check. A lot of Democrats have been pushing it over the since Biden went into office. I think that some Democrats want a perpetual stimulus check until the pandemic is over. If that doesn't happen, his next best option, which is unlikely to happen, but his next best option is to just stop spending money. This is one of the biggest contributing factors to the whole inflation saga, is that this new money is being injected into the economy, all this liquidity, it's too much money chasing too few goods, and it's just not going to happen when it comes to stop spending money. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, she even conceded a few months ago that all this Biden spending has been a contributing factor to price inflation. Now, she didn't say it's the main factor, but at least she conceded that somewhat is adding to these inflationary pressures. Then even if he doesn't spend new money, he's still approving these outlandish multi-trillion-dollar spending bills without this Biden green agenda. And, fair to say, if a Republican were in office too, that person would still be approving these $5-6 trillion deficit finance budgets, which is unsustainable in the long term.
So once again, Andrew, I'm going to ask you to play Nostradamus or Cassandra, whichever you prefer. What do you see happening in the next year?
Well, Mark, it is time for us to do what we have been doing. And that time is every day. Every day, it is time for us to agree that there are things and tools that are available to us to slow this thing down.
Thank you, Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, for anybody who prefers their sentences with punctuation and reason, Andrew, do you have another prognostication for us?
Again, it goes back to that stimulus check. Perhaps you would try to bribe voters with their own money, but from the reports I've seen, the administration, they're trying to hit the reset button because of how dreadful the administration is performing. Biden's approval rating is at 40%. And, people don't like what he's doing. They don't like how he's handling inflation. They don't like how he's, managing the economy or whatever the case. Some strategists I've spoken to, they say that inflation is going to subside toward the end of the year. So perhaps if they're accurate, which, they're smart guys and gals. I engage with them regularly, throughout the week. They know what they're doing. They're combing through this data. They're close to all these professionals, but these are the same people who said inflation would be transitory. Now, again, if they're accurate, I think this would give Biden some leeway to say, okay, fine, inflation's coming down, which means it gives us carte blanche to spend even more money come midterm elections, and therefore, you should support the Democrats to advance this agenda of, of more child tax payments, for example, or more student debt relief. Now, don't get me started to do student debt relief, but I think that's what he could do. He also said that the Fed he's confident the Fed could handle inflation, which, they have a poor track record, so I think that's going to happen. Overall, all I think he can do or he will do is just spend more money despite the inflation.
I think one of the most important questions that we can be asking, Andrew, is how this impacts folks out there. How are they going to manage? Because it's all well and good we talk about the printing of $1 trillion here or $500 million there. That doesn't really mean anything to your average guy and gal on the street. They're not seeing that, this is taking a fractional percent here, this is taking a fractional percent there, it's costing me a fractional percent more. So what are the real world impacts of what's been happening over the last year?
Well, inflation is essentially the debasement of your currency. As Howard Beale said in Network, a buck buys a nickel's worth. Those are real world consequences. You go to your bank account, you have to take more out to pay for the same level of goods. And if you're even lucky to get those goods, because there's scarcity is so prevalent throughout the U.S. economy and to be fair, the global economy too. All your savings, that's being eroded day by day. The only thing that I could see the average person do is just go in a stock market, buy a dividend-paying stock or index fund, and try to survive that way to beat inflation. But overall, it's very challenging for most poor and middle-class people to thrive in an inflationary environment. Some economists like Paul Krugman, they say that, inflation doesn't impact the poor and middle class, which is complete, balderdash. It's poppycock because the whole with inflation is that when you print money, the people closest to the spigot, the politicians, Wall Street, institutional investors, hedge funds, money managers, whatever the case, they benefit the most from that. Then when that money goes throughout the entire economy, $1 trillion worth, then everyone else gets pittance. They get this, this crumpled up Federal Reserve note. So yeah, these are real world impacts, and people see it every single day. They have been seeing it every day for the last year, despite everyone saying, "Oh, and what are you talking about? Inflation? It's not happening." And then they finally admit, "Yeah, you know what? Everybody was right. But you know what? Inflation is going to come down soon," which, it's hard to see that happening at all. Just one more thing. If you look at energy prices, I talked to some guys who say oil is going to come down, around November because all these companies are going to start producing more. The problem is that another strategist I spoke to, he was telling me that companies are so scared of pumping out more oil because of the whole regulatory uncertainty of the Biden green agenda. So that's going to add more pressure to the average person when it comes to filling up a tank of gasoline or even producing food, because of course energy is a major component of food production. So overall, I feel for a lot of people who are perhaps out of work, who run a small business. You see a lot of small businesses struggling in today's environment because of inflation and the renewed public health restrictions. So no, my heart goes out to a lot of people. Of course, my heart doesn't go out to politicians because they're the ones who cause this mess. But overall, most people, yeah, I feel for them.
Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
Later in the show, we'll be continuing this weighing and measuring of Biden's first year in office by examining how your constitutional rights have fared under this president and this Congress. But next up, we'll be looking at the legislative hits and misses of the last 12 months. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Presidents have always touted their performance through the substantial legislation they passed during their terms in office. Now, just 1 year into his presidency, we're asking the question, how has President Biden performed on this metric? Does he have something in hand with which to woo voters to the Democratic Party in 2022? Or is it more a failure to launch? Well, digging deep into the legislative hits and misses, we have with us Mr. James Fight, armed with the facts to tell us what went right, what went wrong for Biden during his first 12 months in office. Great to have you here, Jim.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
So tell me, Jim, averaging up the wins and the losses, is Biden sinking or swimming?
I would say sinking. There are two ways to look at this, Mark. There's quantity and there's quality. And on both fronts, on the quantity front, for sure, Biden is sinking. On the quality front, compared to what he said he wanted to do during the campaign and, his first year in office, he's still sinking. Biden has signed into law a total of 81 bills since he took office. So that's, we got about a year. Now, to people that don't pay much attention to Congress, you might think, man, 81 laws, that's a lot.
It does seem a lot.
It does seem a lot. But in Trump's last 2 years, so the 116th Congress, Donald Trump signed 344 bills into law, which averages 172 a year. And that's when he did not have a friendly House, right? The Democrats were in control of the House for the 116th Congress. Now,
one might almost describe Donald Trump as being the unity candidate, wouldn't they, with those kind of numbers?
Compared to Biden, for sure, which is kind of ironic given
That's Biden's whole,
right? Run unity platform and not Trump platform, which is funny in itself. For the 115th Congress, which was, the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, when he did have that Republican trifecta, it was a total of 443 bills signed into law, or 221 a year.
Well, nobody ever accused Donald Trump of being lazy. So now, without being too brutal to President Joe Biden, there have been some successes. What were they?
Yeah, there have. 81 bills signed into law is 81 bills signed into law. And they're not, that's where we kind of get back to the quality versus quantity. Most of those are going to be spending bills. There are some, of course, there's what I call fluff bills, which I'm sure the people that introduce them would be offended by that. But things like renaming federal buildings, awarding somebody a congressional medal. Yeah, designating a week as blah, 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 whatever week. Those are technically bills signed into law, but nobody else cares, and no one's going to remember. Honestly, no one's going to remember after that president's term is over. So part of those 81 bills is that. Then, of course, you've got a little bit of, economic sanctions against China and Russia and stuff like that. But mostly it's going to be spending bills. And the biggest, that's where his biggest successes come in, I think, are going to be the pandemic relief bills, which, those are they are successes because that is something that he wanted to do. But I also feel that even with Republican control, that some of those would have still happened. Probably the biggest success is going to be his infrastructure spending that he did get through, the so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill.
And now it's time for the losses, unfortunately, Jim. So what are some of the biggest legislative blows that he's faced?
Man, Build Back Better is the first one that immediately leaps to mind, segueing off the win on the other infrastructure bill, the one that is, they called it a human infrastructure bill. Really, it's a big socialist wish list, kind of retooled to technically fit the very open-ended definition of infrastructure. And, that failing to pass that, I think, has been probably his biggest legislative loss. But, close on the heels, the two voting rights bills that were very big issues for the Democrats also failed. And, of course, the bills that never actually made it to vote.
Now, normally, Jim, a president would be blaming such legislative roadblocks on the opposition party, calling them obstructionists. But Biden doesn't seem to have that luxury, does he?
Not really. Not with the trifecta of power. But really, what has tanked the legislative agenda so far is two Democrats. That's, of course, Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kirsten Sinema of Arizona.
Yeah, it seems to me that he seems to be arguing, especially with the voting bills that he's been looking at recently, that it's wrong for the minority to hold up the majority, which is strange, seeing as it seems to be a 52-seat minority arguing against the 48-seat majority, which obviously doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the math doesn't work out there.
It really doesn't. So final question for you, Jim. If you're going to give me a scorecard of Joe Biden's legislative hits and misses, a scale of 1 to 10, where do you put him on this?
You got to give him a little bit of credit because he did get some things. I don't even know how much of that he was responsible for, really. We'll give him like a 2 or a 3.
A 2 or a 3 for Joe Biden.
Quality and quantity, very low, but he did get a few wins.
James Fight, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Now, coming up later, has Joe Biden been good for the nation's founding documents? But after this short break, we ask, what has this administration done for America's standing on the international stage? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Afghanistan withdrawal may have permanently tarred President Biden's reputation on foreign affairs. But for those who watch closely, his reputation wasn't all that hot to begin with. How did the president fare in his first year in office, and how is America standing in the world now that these supposed adults are back in charge? Well, to figure out these answers, we're joined once again by former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller Dave Patterson to see if the president has been found wanting. Welcome back to the show, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
Now, let's cut to the chase, Dave. On a score of 1 to 10, where do you rate President Biden's foreign policy 1 year in office?
A struggling 3.
That's generous for what a lot of people have been saying, even in the usually favorable Biden media. So what are some of the most egregious errors that we've seen during Biden's first year?
Well, I think that the 3 comes from the fact that I'm going to give him more credit. as Woody Allen once said, 80% of life is showing up. So they showed up, and but I think the most egregious of the foreign policy gaffes would have to be starting at the very beginning when the negotiations of the START treaty, the new START treaty, that's the strategic arms reduction talks, and before President Biden even got a day into office, he gave President Putin in Russia 5 years to work on this particular problem, and it's a significant strategic problem of nuclear arms limitations, when the previous administration, President Trump's administration, was struggling to give them just 1 year, and that's what Putin had asked for. He wanted a year extension for the negotiations to take place without much pressure. Biden turns around and gives him 5. That's ridiculous.
It almost seems as though you get mugged in a New York park, and then as the mugger's walking away with your wallet, you say, "Hey, you forgot about the $20 stashed down my sock."
Yeah, or my Rolex watch, right? No, it's true. I mean, the Biden administration is best characterized by their interim national strategic guidance that they put out. And it is just indicative of how they view the world. You know, it was 23 pages, 17 pages, if you don't count the title page, table of contents, and so forth. And in that 17 pages, they mentioned climate change 27 times. They mentioned China 15 times. So twice as much time was given to the weather than our primary threat, China. And oh, by the way, when it comes to North Korea was mentioned twice. So you don't have much of an understanding of what's really the problem in the world, and it continues from there. That's exactly the way they have continued from actually day 2, if you want to be precise.
Well, let's talk about North Korea briefly. Now, Dave, I'm old enough to remember when President Trump and Kim Jong-un, they stepped happily back and forth across the Korean demilitarized zone. Now, Leader Kim had some fiery Twitter spats with the Donald, and some amusing ones at that, to be fair. But it seems to me that with these recent rocket launches, all that progress, all that familiarity that was breeding between the two nations, it's all been undone. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think that President Kim gets it. He understands who he's talking with, and much in the same way, you know, that the Obama administration presented themselves as somewhat feckless to the North Koreans. So the Biden administration has kept that theme going, and he understands that. Trump, on the other hand, was as perhaps his style was obnoxious. He nonetheless got his point across, and he was believable to the Kim Jong-un administration. They got it. They understood that they needed to do something in order to change the dynamic, and Trump was there to ensure that they did. In fact, after their discussions, the missile tests did stop for quite some time. Only since September have they started.
So, Dave, when Donald Trump was trying to bring North Korea into the international fold, as it were, what he offered was not just threats. It was essentially an offer to make North Korea a rich nation, but not through taking money from poor people in America and giving it to rich people in North Korea, because there are some rich people in North Korea, of course, but more through allowing the economy to flourish, building projects, things like this. And it was a very exciting time. But now it seems that the Biden administration, particularly the foreign affairs administration aspect of that, they seem to be falling back on the idea of, let's take cash dollars that the taxpayer are so generously giving us and putting this to countries that don't necessarily share our interests, don't care about our interests, and in some cases are actively opposed to our interests?
Well, I think it's a matter of basic philosophies. When President Trump came into office, it was, make America great again, America first. He had a very, very clear and unambiguous point of view. And that was evident in how he ran the foreign policy. And so it would be very strange for President Trump to take money from American pockets and give it to North Korean pockets. His point of view is that you can build a country from within and you don't have to buy it from without. And it is just in the same approach he's using in the United States. I mean, Biden is building back broke. I mean, his whole purpose in life is to take from those who produce and give it to those who will not. And it's that simple.
Yeah, now let's get back to the Biden administration here, because we are obviously evaluating Joe Biden after his first year in office. Now, it was a year ago that the media told America that the country's world stage reputation would be restored. But when we see him being corrected by other leaders, gently cajoled along, treated almost like the elderly uncle who's fallen asleep at the dinner table, has the U.S. foreign reputation suffered under this presidency?
Absolutely. And the only reason they treat him like the elderly uncle who has fallen asleep at the dinner table is because that's how he behaves. And you're exactly right. The reputation of the United States has been sullied by this administration's foreign policy. It lacks a strategy. John Bolton, this morning in a large Washington paper op-ed, said that very same thing. Said, Putin understands and has a strategy for the Ukraine. It's too bad that Biden does not.
All right, let's talk about the direction of foreign policy under the Biden administration. What do you see that they see are their key priorities?
Well, I think that their key priorities are just what they say. I mean, they're not bashful. They think they can change the weather in the next 100 years, and that's the most important thing for them. The fact that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are substantial threats to the United States doesn't seem to bother them as much. And so that's how they behave. I mean, what is another thing that they did when they came into office? Secretary Blinken takes the Houthi militants, the Iran-backed Houthi militants, off the terrorist list. Why would you do that? They are arguably terrorists, as the UAE found out this morning, with attacks on the oil refineries. They just don't get it. They think that they're back in their Ivy League schoolrooms debating foreign policy. They are not. This is a dangerous world, and they don't treat it that way, Mark.
So a very generous 3 from Dave Patterson. Dave, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Always happy to talk to you.
Coming up after this short message, we're back talking liberty with Scott D. Cosenza. Has President Biden been good or bad for this country's founding documents? Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back. On this special Talking Liberty segment, we're going to continue the evaluation of President Joe Biden's first year, but with a twist. Rather than examine the president directly, we're asking the question, how has the Constitution fared under this presidency so far? Now, there's no one better placed to help us answer that question than Uprising host and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
So, Scott, how would you rate Joe Biden, 1 to 10, as a defender of the Constitution?
Well, I reject the idea that I can't give him a 0. And I think that's the appropriate grade because, quite simply, I don't think that it factors much into his decision-making or that of his chief aides in decision-making. I think if we take a look, for instance, at the vaccine mandate, it just doesn't seem like, or the vaccine mandates, I should say, plural. It's not that there's just one. There doesn't seem to be much consideration given to the constitutional rights of Americans. It seems to be all about what would we like the policy to be, and then let's go ahead and implement the policies that might get us there, rather than first seeking fidelity to the Constitution.
I think it was Barry Goldwater who said that when asked what he would do is first he would consider whether it was constitutional and then whether it was doable. It's something along those lines, I believe.
Well, that's right, Mark. Goldwater, it's one of his more famous quotes. And he said that I will not attempt to discover whether legislation is needed before I first determined whether it was constitutionally permissible. And boy, when you hear a quote like that, you just think it's such a shame that Goldwater was never president. So,
all right, well, let's go to the Constitution.
Joe Biden, by the way, has not repeated that, to my knowledge, as a rallying call for his own presidency. So that's why I go ahead with the preferred 0 vote on.
Fair enough, Scott. Fair enough. So back to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. There are many parts made one. Now, which parts did well during Biden's first year in office? Specifically, I want to hear about my two favorites, my two personal favorites, the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. And did the president help or hinder these constitutional amendments?
Well, the expression of and protections of those amendments, I think, has suffered quite a bit under the first year of the Biden presidency. Now, we'll have to see whether that damage is a mere scuff or more lasting. For the First Amendment, I think that the biggest problem that we have and the biggest imposition on it is the discussions with that the administration has, and this, by the way, is not something that I've determined or the people who are in opposition to the Biden presidency have determined. The president and his spokesperson, Jen Psaki, have said themselves that they cooperate or attempt to cooperate with social media organizations to remove the content that they disfavor, whether that's regarding vaccine or health information regarding the coronavirus or other matters. And that seems to be a massive imposition, and perhaps unconstitutionally so, against the First Amendment rights of Americans. It's one thing if you want to say that, for instance, well, there's some people who think that YouTube should be treated like a utility or forced to put up posts that they would rather take down out of some sort of application of the First Amendment to that. I tend to not favor that because they are a private entity. But when I hear Jen Psaki say that they're communicating with regularly these private actors, and it seems like getting them to take down the speech of Americans, well, I have to call that a massive imposition on the First Amendment rights of Americans. When the government tells one person, well, yeah, you have free speech, but we'd sure appreciate it if you wouldn't allow Citizen X to speak the words that they are saying. So that's, not that it might be a theme here, but that's a 0, I think, for the First Amendment. And for the Second Amendment, I think the biggest imposition so far has been the attempt to elevate David Chipman to the ATF, head of the ATF. Chipman is a former ATF agent who left the agency and then spent his time away from the agency as a political actor, trying to really ban the most common firearm that's manufactured today and owned by Americans, namely the AR-15. Now, it's one thing if you have an agency head who tries to implement the goals of his superiors, but it's another if they're sort of out there leading the cause in a way that imposes new restrictions on a fundamental right. And I think that's what we had with Mr. Chipman. His candidacy was so bad that Democrats said that they would vote against him, and that's why it had to be withdrawn. So that wasn't just, I think, a political loss for the Biden administration, which is what it was seen as, but also a telling notion of where he is with the Second Amendment, which is to say that he's no supporter of it, and it's under constant threat so long as he's in office and able to move the levers of power against Americans' expression of that right.
Well, fortunately, as you've pointed out to me before, America is 50 experiments in democracy. So different states have different measures on in being able to support or even work against the elements of the Constitution. Now, how do you think
the 50 laboratories of democracy?
50 laboratories of democracy.
Yes.
That's right. Now, how do you think Biden's been on maintaining what that actually is? That's 50 individual states cooperating as one United States, e pluribus unum. more specifically, Scott, the power of states compared to the power of the federal government and how that separation works.
Well, Mark, one of the reasons why limited government advocates, generally speaking, did not approve of Biden's bid for the presidency is because he's not somebody who, in word or deed, kind of gives life to the 9th and 10th Amendments, which combine to say that, that what's not limited and enumerated by the Constitution is, giving those powers to the federal government reside both with the states and the people, respectively. So this is more of a, the view of the administration in practice and in word is that there's just not much there in terms of reserving these things for others. It's the federal government has a sort of plenary lawmaking authority. Now, it wasn't Joe Biden who said this, but we saw recently in the vaccine mandate Supreme Court case that Sonia Sotomayor was pilloried for talking about the sort of general police powers of the federal government, of which there are none that are expressed in the Constitution, for instance, unlike state governments, which do have general police powers. So that also, I think we're adding up, that's another zero for the...
0 plus 0 plus
right,
0.
Exactly.
Now,
the power
it's
of
been
zero.
a while since I've done such
I'm not a
algebra.
math major, but...
All right. Now, it's sometimes difficult to rate a presidency, not for you, obviously, Scott, but there's obviously different factors, different times, circumstances applied during different presidencies. For example, COVID. This was, it was clearly something that led to Donald Trump not being in office anymore and to the rise of Joe Biden. But it seems to me, Scott, that if a president goes into office with a goal to booster the nation's founding documents, he or she can't go too far wrong, can they? Or am I being mindlessly naive on this?
Well, it's been a long time since we've had a president, I think, that might have actually gone in with that as more of a talking point. I've said this many times on the Uprising podcast, and I will say it here now. I think that one of the main reasons why Biden was elevated to the presidency is on the promise of no mean tweets. And as far as I know, Mark, he has delivered 100% on that. So just so if we're tallying things up, that is, I think, a promise kept. And I expect him to honor it throughout his presidency. But on the notion that he has somehow bolstered our constitutional rights or the administration's fealty to them or respect for those rights, I'm going to have to go with another big fat zero, unfortunately.
Scott DiCosenza giving the worst score of the day for our Liberty Nation radio show. Scott, thank you ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's Liberty Nation Radio. I'd like to thank Radio America for hosting, and our guests Andrew Moran, James Veit, David Patterson, and Scott DiCosenza. And of course, my sincere thanks to you at home for listening. Let's finish up as we started. Has President Biden been found wanting after his first year in office? Well, that's a question that each voter has to ask themselves. Many in the political realm quote former Clinton strategist James Carville when it comes to who wins at the ballot box. It's the economy, stupid, he famously said. And that has often proved true, but something feels different this time around. Over the last year, we've seen freedoms restricted more than at any other time in recent history, rightly or wrongly, and perhaps that has sparked something that was lying deep and covered. The urge for liberty can be oft overlooked or seem unimportant or non-urgent at times, but when we're reminded that liberty is the lifeblood of all of us, and that without that we are far poorer, and maybe folks will finally look beyond what the talking heads in the fourth estate tell us, and demand that the ideals of freedom once again take their rightful place in the halls of power. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for
I think
LibertyNation.com.
we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.